I still remember that day as if it had been etched into my bones, a memory that refuses to fade no matter how much time passes. It wasn't the kind of day that demanded attention, the kind of day with storms that whipped the trees or accidents that left sirens wailing in the distance. It wasn't marked by fireworks, arguments, or grand displays of emotion. On the surface, it was ordinary. It was quiet, too quiet, in fact. The kind of quiet that feels almost alive, pressing itself into every corner of a room, into the very air you breathe, making your chest tighten in a way that you can neither explain nor ignore. There was a heaviness that seemed to settle over everything, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it already knew would come. I was sitting in my son's living room, in the old, familiar armchair that I had once thought of as mine, the one that had been placed there when I first visited their home years ago, the one I had always pulled closer to the window, so that I could watch the sunlight shift across the room throughout the day. The sunlight that filtered through the thin curtains that morning was gentle, soft, almost tender, yet it cast long, quiet shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch across the room and into my thoughts. Everything looked as it always did from the outside. The furniture was arranged neatly, the scent of coffee lingered faintly in the air, the cushions fluffed and waiting. It looked like an ordinary morning in an ordinary home. But inside me, there was a weight I could not name, a tension that seemed to rise up from the soles of my feet, coil around my stomach, and rest heavily in my chest. It was as though some invisible hand was pressing down on my heart, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder even to trust what my senses were telling me. I remember the exact moment she spoke, her words cutting through the stillness of that room like a sudden, sharp gust of cold wind. She had been standing by the kitchen doorway, her hands lightly resting on the frame, and her voice, though soft, carried with it an unmistakable firmness, a certainty that seemed almost rehearsed. "Mom," she said, and I felt my pulse hitch ever so slightly. "I think it's time for you to leave." I froze in that moment. The words didn't make my heart race, nor did they ignite the familiar surge of anger I might have expected from years of small frustrations and disagreements. No, my heart simply stopped for a beat, as though it, too, were trying to understand what had just been said. My mind became a blur of fragments. The years I had spent raising my son, the countless meals I had prepared, the nights I had stayed awake when he was sick, the times I had smiled and offered advice even when it wasn't asked for. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a smile crept across my face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, nor was it one of joy or laughter. It wasn't the kind of smile that comes when someone is victorious or has finally proven a point. It was quiet, calm, soft, but beneath that calm there was a strange, unexpected relief, like the first deep breath you take after holding it in for far too long, or the moment you release a balloon you've been clutching so tightly that your fingers ache. It was a relief that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place I hadn't even realized existed, a place that had been buried under years of expectation, love, and a desperate desire to belong. The room froze around me. Everyone else was shocked. My son, who had almost always been my protector, my safe harbor in the stormy moments of life, didn't say a word. His eyes were wide, perhaps caught between loyalty to his wife and the invisible bond that had always tied him to me. He nodded slowly, almost mechanically, almost as if he agreed with her, and in that silent nod, I felt a strange, bitter clarity. The person I had spent a lifetime loving, supporting, and nurturing could no longer stand by me when it mattered most. And in that realization, I felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and liberation. I sat there, my body still, my hands resting on my lap, and I realized that my mind was racing faster than my body could move. I thought of the years I had dedicated to this family, the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the quiet tears I had shed alone when things weren't perfect. And yet, in that moment of apparent rejection, I felt no panic, no hysteria, no need to justify myself. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply smiled. That smile, calm and steady, was my first act of reclaiming myself. It was my silent declaration that my worth, my dignity, my life, was not something to be measured or dictated by the whims of others. It was my recognition that even if the people I loved most could not see my value, even if the person I thought would always be there for me chose to remain silent, my life still held meaning. My heart still held strength, and my soul still held courage. Time seemed to stretch in that room, the sunlight spilling lazily across the floor, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background, the faint ticking of the wall clock marking each second that now felt heavier than a lifetime. And in that suspended moment, I understood something profound. Life does not always unfold the way we hope, and the people we love are not always capable of loving us in return. But even in abandonment, even in silence and rejection, there is a space, however small, where we can stand tall, where we can breathe, and where we can finally meet ourselves. It was in that smile, that quiet, almost imperceptible act, that I discovered a truth I had long forgotten. That my strength was never dependent on their acceptance, my happiness was never contingent on their approval, and my life, my very existence, was never something anyone else could take away. That day, as the sunlight touched the floor and the shadows stretched across the walls, I stepped into a new chapter, one where I would no longer be defined by the love I received, the loyalty I expected, or the roles I was assigned. I was, for the first time in a very long time, truly free, and the smile I wore, gentle and serene, was the quiet beginning of a life I was about to reclaim. Before that day, we were like every other family. Or at least, that's what I believed, what I clung to in the quiet moments of reflection when I reminded myself that love and loyalty were supposed to be unshakable. I had spent decades raising my son, nurturing him, guiding him, and filling his world with warmth, comfort, and care. My life had always revolved around him, the meals I prepared with painstaking attention to detail, the stories I read to him before he fell asleep as a child, the endless nights I sat by his bedside when he was sick, soothing his fears even when my own heart ached in silence. I believed family was forever, an unbroken chain of support and devotion. I believed love meant sacrifice, and I had given everything I had, expecting nothing in return except the simple acknowledgement that I had been there, that I had done my part. Our mornings were quiet rituals of habit and care. I would wake up before anyone else, the soft hum of the electric kettle filling the kitchen as I prepared tea just the way he liked it. A little strong, a little sweet, just enough warmth to carry him into the day. He would stir in the bedroom, still groggy, the sheets tangled around him, and I would hear the soft shuffle of his feet as he padded to the bathroom, brushing his teeth and running a hand through his hair. My daughter-in-law would rush through the house, her heels clicking against the floorboards, her voice sharp with the urgency of 1,000 tasks pressing on her at once. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a rhythm, a harmony, an unspoken understanding that this was the cadence of our shared lives. There were smiles, fleeting but genuine, laughter that bubbled up in the kitchen while breakfast was prepared, and even small arguments, playful, almost forgettable squabbles that left us laughing and shaking our heads at the absurdity of life. These were the moments that made the house feel alive, that made me believe that the family I loved so deeply was intact, whole, and capable of weathering anything. I loved my son, loved him more than words could ever capture, more than any simple phrase could hold. I loved him for the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the little things that brought him joy, for the quiet gestures of kindness he extended to strangers, for the moments when he leaned on me without even realizing it. And I loved seeing him happy, because his happiness had always been my anchor, my reason for enduring, for pushing through the long, lonely days of raising a child into adulthood. But somewhere along the way, imperceptible at first, a small crack had formed in the delicate fabric of our family life. The crack was tiny, almost invisible, like a hairline fracture in glass that you notice only when light hits it just right. And yet, it grew, slowly, steadily, until the tiny fissure became something you could no longer ignore. The small things started to bother her, my daughter-in-law, things I never realized could hold so much weight, things I had never thought to consider. She would glance at me with a fleeting look of impatience when I moved a chair slightly closer to the table, or when I reached for a spice jar she thought I shouldn't touch. "Mom, can you not sit there?" she would say one morning, her voice calm but carrying an edge that cut deeper than any raised tone could. Another day, she would wrinkle her nose at a dish I had prepared with care and effort, shaking her head before brushing it off with the words, "Mom, why do you still make that dish?" Each comment, each subtle dismissal felt small at first, almost inconsequential. And yet, as the days passed, those words began to accumulate, like drops of water carving into stone, leaving behind marks that were impossible to erase. At first, I brushed them off, telling myself that perhaps I was too sensitive, that perhaps she didn't mean anything by it, that maybe it was just her way of asserting herself in her home, in her marriage, in her role as the person who now held the reins of this household. But as the weeks went by, the words began to feel heavier, more deliberate. The tone became colder, more distant, like ice slowly spreading over the warmth of our once comfortable home. And I began to notice the subtle shift in my son's demeanor, too. The way his voice softened when he addressed me, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he let the silences stretch longer than they had before, as if he were trying not to see what was happening before him. The love I had always assumed to be unconditional, the love I had known and trusted for decades, began to feel conditional. Only given if I fit into a role that was no longer mine, only extended if I conformed to expectations I had never been asked to fulfill, only offered when I stayed quiet, invisible, and contained. The home that had once been a sanctuary, a place of laughter, warmth, and shared memories, began to feel like a stage where I was no longer cast in a meaningful role, where my presence was tolerated but not valued, where my voice was heard but not truly listened to. And as the realization sank in, I felt a subtle but persistent ache in my chest, a quiet sorrow that whispered of things lost and moments never reclaimed. I tried, in my quiet way, to adjust, to bend, to find a place where I could exist without causing friction, without drawing attention, without becoming the target of disapproval. I would make tea and set it on the table silently, hoping no one would comment. I would fold the laundry without speaking, silently noticing how the little imperfections in the folds might be criticized. I would sit quietly in the corner of the living room, pretending to read a book, pretending not to notice the dismissive glances, pretending not to hear the whispered instructions my daughter-in-law gave to my son that included every detail of household management, instructions that implicitly excluded me from the decision-making, from the conversations, from the life I had once known as my own. And still, I loved him, my son, with all the depth that a mother's heart can hold. I loved him even when his silence spoke louder than words, even when his nods were passive, even when the warmth I had poured into his life seemed to be returned only with distance and cool civility. I loved him because love, for me, was not transactional. It was not conditional. It was not something I expected in return. It simply existed, quietly, unshakable, and yet, as I sat in the quiet corners of my own thoughts, I realized that love alone could not prevent the growing tension, could not heal the invisible chasms forming in the home I had once thought was safe, could not protect me from the creeping loneliness of being present, but unseen. Those were the days that built the foundation for what was to come. The ordinary mornings, the whispered dismissals, the small frustrations and misunderstandings, the unspoken rules that I did not know I had to follow, they all coalesced into a silent, mounting pressure that I could feel pressing against my chest, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. And yet, amidst all of it, I continued to smile, to nurture, to love, to participate in the rhythm of a household that had slowly become alien to me. I continued, because that is what mothers do, because that is what I had been taught, because that was all I knew. Looking back, I can see now that these ordinary, seemingly harmless moments were the threads of a tapestry that was quietly unraveling. The family I had believed to be like any other, full of love, warmth, laughter, and shared history, was slowly revealing a fracture that I could neither repair nor ignore. And it was in this quiet unraveling, this slow erosion of the familiar, that the first seeds of change were planted, waiting, like a patient shadow, for the day when the weight of neglect and misunderstanding would finally become impossible to bear. The tension began like a whisper, barely noticeable at first, a subtle shift in the rhythm of our days that I almost convinced myself was imagined. It was a sarcastic comment thrown over a casual conversation, a dismissive glance that lingered just a second too long, a sigh barely audible but heavy with judgment. At first, I told myself that this was normal, that every family had its moments of friction, its small misunderstandings that required patience and grace. I reasoned with myself, thinking that perhaps my daughter-in-law was stressed with work, with household responsibilities, with the endless pressure of managing a life I had once thought shared with me, a life that now seemed to exclude me. I told myself it was nothing, a passing storm that would blow over with time. And yet, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, those small tensions began to multiply, like cracks appearing in plaster that at first seem harmless but gradually grow into something that can no longer be ignored. The glances became colder, the words sharper, the silences heavier. The very air of the house felt different, as though it had been drained of warmth and replaced with an almost imperceptible hostility that pressed down on my chest, made my limbs heavy, and my heart ache in a quiet, relentless way. One evening, hopping to hold onto the semblance of connection, I attempted to join them for dinner. I had imagined it as a simple, ordinary gesture, a moment to share stories from my day, perhaps evoke a laugh, perhaps hear a genuine question about how I was, how my morning had gone, or what small thing had caught my attention in the garden. But the atmosphere was already charged with an unspoken tension, a quiet energy that seemed to hum and throb between us like electricity just below the skin. My daughter-in-law barely looked at me, her gaze skimming past me as though I were a shadow, her attention absorbed entirely by my son, to whom she whispered instructions so intimate, so detailed, as if I had no presence, as if I were not even there. I tried to sit quietly, to smile, to show that I was still part of this home, but each whispered command, each sidelong glance, each subtle tightening of her lips, reminded me in small but devastating ways that I no longer belonged. My son, ever the gentle soul, spoke softly, almost apologetically. "Can we talk later, Mom?" The words were kind, his voice laced with hesitation and regret, but the message was clear. I realized in that moment with a clarity that made my chest constrict that I was no longer a part of their world. I was no longer a participant in the daily life of the home I had helped nurture, the home I had once thought inseparable from my love and effort. I was a guest at my own son's table, a shadow in the spaces I had once filled with laughter, warmth, and love. My presence, once central and taken for granted, was now marginal, peripheral, tolerated rather than welcomed. I attempted, gently, to reclaim even a fragment of my place. "I just wanted to share a story about today," I said softly, a small attempt to bridge the growing chasm. But she shook her head, her voice firm and final. "Not now." The words struck me like a cold wind cutting through my chest. There was no room for negotiation, no hint of compromise, no glimmer of acknowledgement. And still, I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply nodded, inhaled a slow, steady breath, and walked away, carrying the ache inside me with quiet dignity, with the unspoken knowledge that the world I had believed to be my home was shifting beneath my feet in ways I could not control. These moments, seemingly minor on their own, repeated endlessly over days, weeks, months. Each small dismissal, each overlooked presence, each quiet insult, each word that carried an edge, built an invisible wall between us, brick by brick, higher and higher, until it felt impossible to breathe within the confines of my own son's home. The wall was not shouted, not thrown, not slammed in anger. It was quiet, deliberate, insidious. It was the slow erosion of intimacy, of belonging, of trust. And as I felt it grow, I became increasingly aware of a terrifying truth. I was beginning to feel invisible. Not forgotten entirely, but acknowledged only in the shallowest sense, present but irrelevant, there but not there. I could see the smiles they gave each other, the whispered conversations in which I had no role, the shared jokes and glances that I could not penetrate. And in my heart, the ache of being unseen deepened, a quiet, steady sorrow that no amount of endurance, no act of patience, no effort at silent understanding could erase. I began to notice how my hands moved more cautiously, how I timed my movements to avoid disruption, how I silenced my own voice before speaking, how I had become a careful observer of my own life rather than a participant. The simplest gestures, reaching for a cup, moving a chair, laughing at a shared story, were now exercises in restraint, in careful navigation, in avoidance. Each day, I watched as my place in the home diminished subtly but undeniably. And the small tensions, once ignorable, now compounded into a relentless, almost unbearable weight. I began to understand, with a clarity that was painful in its honesty, that love, effort and presence could not always prevent alienation. That sometimes, despite decades of giving, of nurturing, of shaping lives and hearts, the people you love can quietly distance themselves, building barriers you do not yet see, until one day you find yourself standing outside them entirely. And yet, in the midst of this growing isolation, there was a strange, quiet resilience forming in me. I noticed it not in moments of triumph, nor in moments of confrontation, but in the simple act of enduring, of showing up despite the weight pressing on me, of moving through the house with my head held a little higher than before, of reminding myself with each quiet, painful step that my life, my heart, and my dignity did not depend on their acknowledgement. I was becoming a witness to my own resilience, a silent observer of the erosion of belonging, and at the same time, an unacknowledged architect of my own strength. The little things, the everyday slights and dismissals, had begun to shape a new version of me, one capable of standing in quiet defiance, capable of carrying sorrow without losing oneself, capable of seeing truth without collapsing beneath it. It all came to a head on that quiet afternoon, the kind of afternoon that seems ordinary at first glance, the kind that lulls you into thinking that nothing significant will happen, that life will continue its predictable rhythm of light and shadow, of routine and familiarity, the kind of afternoon where the sun streams gently through the windows, painting golden streaks across the floorboards and the furniture, where the hum of daily life seems steady and reassuring, and yet beneath that calm, something fragile is already shifting, something almost imperceptible is moving, waiting, preparing for the inevitable. I had been sitting in the living room, folding laundry with the methodical, almost meditative motion that had always comforted me, the soft rustle of clothes in my hands, the gentle fold of fabric over fabric, the way the familiar scent of detergent and fabric softener mixed with the lingering aroma of morning coffee, forming a small sanctuary of routine, a small island of control in a world that, for so long, had demanded everything of me and given little in return. I was focused on the simple, grounding act of completing the task, thinking perhaps of what I would make for dinner later, or which of my son's favorite dishes I could prepare that week, unaware that the quiet, ordinary rhythm I was immersed in was about to shatter, unaware that a single sentence would cascade through my life like a falling stone, rippling outward in ways I could not yet understand. She walked in that afternoon, moving through the room with her usual briskness, though today her step seemed sharper, more deliberate, echoing faintly against the floor in a way that made my heart tighten ever so slightly, though I could not yet comprehend why. I didn't sense any unusual tension at first. The air was still, the sunlight still spilled across the carpet, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall marking each second as it always had. But then she spoke, and in the calm, measured tone that had become familiar yet increasingly alien to me over the past months, she said words I had never imagined I would hear, words that struck through the quiet like a sudden, sharp crack of glass. "Mom, I think it's time for you to leave." In that moment, everything froze. Time seemed to stop, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a quiet, suffocating, weighty way that pressed down upon my chest, making it hard to breathe, making my limbs feel suddenly heavy, making the familiar walls of my son's home seem to shrink around me, enclosing me in a space that had once felt safe, nurturing, familiar. Those words pierced through the calm like a knife, cutting through decades of memory, cutting through the warmth of countless shared meals, bedtime stories, whispered advice, comforting embraces, laughter echoing through the rooms, the countless small gestures of care and devotion that had defined my existence. My heart seemed to falter, not with fear, not with anger, but with an acute, crystalline clarity that made every fiber of my being stand still. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt tight, my chest constricted, and yet my mind was racing faster than ever, sifting through years of memories, trying to understand how a home I had helped build could suddenly feel so alien, how a family I had nurtured could suddenly look at me as though I were a stranger, how the life I had devoted myself to could now ask me to step aside, to vanish quietly, to leave behind all that I had given without hesitation, without complaint, without pause. My son, who had always been my anchor, my protector, my silent companion in moments of joy and sorrow alike, remained silent. He did not protest. He did not defend me. He did not even attempt to offer a single word of comfort. His face was calm, but there was a quiet resignation in his eyes, a stillness that spoke louder than any words could. And in that silence, I realized a truth I had been avoiding, one I had not wanted to admit even to myself. I was alone in this house, alone in this family, and perhaps for the first time in my life, I was facing a chapter that did not have a place for me. The weight of that realization settled over me like a shroud, heavy but strangely clarifying. I thought, in that suspended moment, of all the years I had spent nurturing, loving, sacrificing. I remembered the long nights I had stayed awake when he was sick, the countless mornings I had risen before dawn to prepare his favorite breakfast, the stories I had read aloud to him when he was a child, the gentle admonitions, the careful guidance, the silent prayers whispered into the night for his happiness and well-being. And yet, here I was, being told that I no longer belonged, that my presence was no longer desired, that the home I had once thought inseparable from love and family now existed as a space from which I must step away. The house felt different suddenly. The walls seemed taller, as though they had grown overnight to enclose me. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though each breath I drew was weighted with the reality of my exclusion. Every familiar object, the couch where we had shared stories, the coffee table that bore the marks of countless family breakfasts, the little rug that my son had tripped over so many times as a child. All of it now felt charged with a strange, disorienting energy, as if the home itself was acknowledging my shift from center to margin. And yet, strangely, amidst the sudden, acute pain of rejection, I felt a sense of liberation rising quietly, softly, almost imperceptibly, like the faint stirrings of wind before a storm clears the sky. I did not cry, I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not lash out, I simply smiled. That smile was not born of triumph, nor of joy, nor of relief in the conventional sense. It was quiet, calm, resolute. And within it was a profound recognition, a dawning clarity that for the first time I could see the truth without the cloud of fear, expectation, or hope for approval. My worth was not measured by someone else's recognition, my dignity was not defined by their acceptance, and my happiness was not chained to their willingness to include me in their lives. In that smile, I understood something that had eluded me for years. My life was mine, my heart belonged to me, and the world, even when it cast me aside, could not diminish what I had built inside myself, the strength I had cultivated in silence, the love I had nurtured quietly in the corners of my being. And as I sat there, folding laundry that had suddenly lost its mundane comfort and become a meditation of resolve, I realized that this day, which had begun like any other, marked a profound turning point. I was stepping into a life where I could finally measure my value by my own standards, where I could nurture my happiness without seeking validation, where I could live for myself rather than for the approval of others, and where, for the first time, I could see clearly the possibility of a new beginning, a fresh chapter, a life unburdened by the expectations, judgments, and conditional love of those who could not see me for who I truly was. In that moment of quiet abandonment, of apparent loss, I discovered something I had long forgotten but had always carried within. That freedom, that liberation, often comes not with applause or recognition, but in the silent acceptance of truth, in the calm acknowledgement that even when doors close, even when loved ones step back, even when a life you built with care seems to reject you, you still have the power to rise, to smile, and to step forward into a life that is finally, entirely, your own. After that day, I left the house. Not with anger, not with bitterness, not with the kind of dramatic flair that people imagine accompanies such moments in stories, but with a quiet calm, a deliberate steadiness that surprised even me. My steps were measured, my head held high, each movement a testament to the years I had carried others' expectations, and the moment I decided to reclaim my own life. I packed only what I needed, letting go of the objects that tied me to a life that no longer wanted me, keeping only those that carried memories of self-worth, that reminded me of my own voice, my own choices, and my own strength. The apartment I found was small, unassuming, yet it felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without restraint, where the sunlight poured through the windows in gentle streams, bathing the room in warmth that seemed to seep into my bones and heal, if only slightly, the aches of abandonment. The walls were bare at first, echoing with the silence of someone who was learning, slowly and cautiously, how to live alone without fear, without shame, without apology. I surrounded myself with things that brought me comfort, pieces of a life I had neglected while pouring myself into others. Books stacked in uneven towers on the shelves, their spines familiar and inviting, each page a portal to worlds where stories unfolded with honesty and emotion, where characters found courage and love in ways that inspired me to rediscover it for myself. Music filled the corners of the apartment, soft melodies that spoke to the heart without words, that wrapped around me and whispered that I was still here, that I still mattered, that my life was still mine to shape. Sunlight spilled across the floor each morning, gentle and forgiving, and I began to see it as a quiet companion, a reminder that the world continued to move forward, and that I too could step into its rhythm without fear. The first night in that apartment, I cried. But it was not for them, not for the family that had turned their backs on me, not for the son who had remained silent in the face of my abandonment. No, these tears were for me, for the years I had allowed myself to shrink, to dim my own light, to contort my heart and soul to fit into a world that no longer welcomed me. Each tear was a release, a cleansing, a soft acknowledgement of the pain I had carried in silence for decades. And as they fell, I felt something I had not felt in years, perhaps even my entire adult life, a sense of freedom. I began slowly, almost hesitantly at first, to rebuild my life. Each day became a small step forward, a deliberate act of self-preservation and self-affirmation. I woke each morning and whispered quietly to myself, phrases that once seemed foreign or indulgent. I am enough. I am worthy. I am free. At first, the words felt strange, almost impossible, but with each repetition, they gained weight, meaning, and a power I had never realized I possessed. I learned to cook again for myself, to prepare meals that nourished not just my body but my spirit. I arranged flowers on the windowsill, tending to them as a gesture of care for something for myself that had long been neglected. I walked in the nearby park, feeling the crunch of leaves under my shoes in autumn, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face in summer, allowing myself to notice the small miracles of daily life that I had once overlooked in the endless efforts to nurture others. Over time, I came to understand that their abandonment was not an ending, but a beginning, a doorway I had never had the courage to open until it was forced upon me. It was a chance to finally live for myself, to honor my own heart without apology, to set boundaries that protected rather than diminished me, to love myself with a devotion that had been long deferred. I discovered that the quiet moments, the rituals of my new life, the unhurried breakfasts, the long afternoons spent reading, the evenings where music filled the silence, were not empty or lonely, but rich with a kind of peace that I had never known in the chaos of trying to belong to a world that did not want me. And though the memory of my son, the longing for connection, and the wish that things could have been different lingered in the back of my heart, it no longer held me captive. Instead, it became a soft ache, a reminder of the lessons I had learned, the resilience I had cultivated, and the love I could still carry within myself without fear of rejection. In the quiet, I began to notice a strength I had forgotten I possessed, a calm that had been buried beneath years of trying to please, of shrinking, of dimming my own presence. I found joy in small things, the sun catching the edge of a leaf, the smell of rain on pavement, the comfort of a warm cup of tea in my hands. I laughed again, quietly at first, then with a growing confidence, allowing the sound to fill the spaces that had been hollowed by neglect. I began to plan small adventures, moments of self-expression and self-discovery that no longer required approval or permission from anyone else. My life became my own, not defined by family expectations, by conditional love, or by the need to be seen as worthy by those who had turned away. And slowly, gradually, I realized the profound truth that had been waiting for me all along. Sometimes, the moments we think will break us, the moments that sting and cut and leave us gasping for breath, are the very moments that set us free. The loss, the abandonment, the silence of those I had loved and nurtured, all of it had led me to this space of quiet strength, of inner peace, of self-recognition. I was not bitter. I was not broken. I was whole in a way I had never been when I was constantly bending, shrinking, and giving myself away to others. I had discovered, in the quiet aftermath of being left behind, a life that was rich, complete, and deeply mine. And so I lived, day by day, learning to trust my own heart again, to honor my own needs, to love myself without hesitation, without apology, without compromise. The apartment became more than a home. It became a testament to resilience, to the quiet power of surviving, to the beauty of starting over when it feels impossible. And in the soft glow of sunlight through my windows, in the gentle rustle of pages as I read, in the music that filled my evenings, I understood a truth that nothing in the past could take from me. My freedom was intact, my life was mine, and my heart was capable of joy, peace, and love once again. Because sometimes, the people we think we cannot live without are the ones who push us toward the life we were always meant to live, the ones who, in stepping away, give us the chance to finally find ourselves. And in that realization, I smiled, a quiet, serene smile, knowing that while the past had shaped me, it did not define me, and that the future, full of sunlight, music, books, and quiet mornings, belonged entirely to me.